Thank you, Mr. Chair. Last week, Director Wray, Chairman Gallagher, Mike Gallagher, and I introduced a bill to address TikTok, which you have spoken about before. And actually, in last year's Worldwide Threat Assessment hearing in March of last year, you said, quote, TikTok is a tool that ultimately is within the control of the Chinese government, and it, to me, screams out with national security concerns, correct?
Correct.
So Mike Gallagher and I introduced this bill, which requires the divestment of TikTok from ByteDance. ByteDance, as you know, is the parent company of TikTok and is controlled ultimately by the Chinese government. Now, interestingly, after we introduced this bill, it got marked up in the House Energy and Commerce Committee. And interestingly, on the morning of that markup, a certain pop-up message and push notification went out to thousands and thousands of users across the country, and it looked like this. Essentially, it said, quote, stop a TikTok shutdown. Congress is planning a total ban of TikTok. Now, of course, setting aside the misinformation of this message, we are not calling for a ban of TikTok, but a divestment. What was very interesting to us is that the app actually used the geolocation targeting data associated with minor children to push this notification to them, to cause them to then call many congressional offices with thousands and thousands of phone calls. Now, when they called these offices, they asked the questions such as the following. What is Congress? What is a congressman? Let me have my TikTok back. And on top of that, in one case, one member of the Energy and Commerce Committee had someone call in impersonating his son, asking to speak with his dad and ask him to allow TikTok to come back. So, Mr. Wray, you've also talked about various threats associated with TikTok, including its ability to potentially mobilize public opinion. This particular push notification pop-up ended up convincing many members of the House Energy and Commerce Committee that day to change from being lean yeses to being hard yeses, because they felt this was exactly the nature of the threat that the legislation was being proposed to address. So could you just talk about whether this is an example of the type of mobilization of public opinion that TikTok, under the control of the Chinese Communist Party, might conduct in the future?
Well, while I can't speak to the specific example, I can tell you that the kind of thing you're describing illustrates why this is such a concern. I think Americans need to understand that distinctions that we take for granted in our system between businesses and government, between the businesses and the government itself, don't exist for all practical purposes in China. So Americans need to ask themselves whether they want to give the Chinese government the ability to control access to their data, whether they want to give the Chinese government the ability to control the information they get through the recommendation algorithm, and whether they want to give the Chinese government the ability to leverage the data, the software on their devices, which allows the Chinese government to compromise their devices if they so choose to exercise.
And just let the record reflect that when you were talking about the type of algorithm or example of what could happen, you were pointing to this very poster with the pop-up menu. Let me just make it clear. You cannot rule out that the Chinese Communist Party actually ordered this particular pop-up to appear on people's phones that day, right?
That's right, and I think it illustrates why when it comes to the algorithm and the recommendation algorithm and the ability to conduct influence operations, that is extraordinarily difficult to detect. And that's what makes it such a pernicious risk.
And that's the problem. You can't tell. Because the CCP ultimately controls ByteDance, ByteDance can manipulate the algorithm and has access to all this data. Now, Director Haines, in this year's threat assessment on page 12, you said TikTok accounts run by a PRC propaganda arm reportedly targeted candidates from both political parties during the U.S. midterms in 2022, right? Can you just speak up?
Sorry, yes, I was just getting to the page, apologies.
So just to be clear, TikTok has already been used to influence the elections in 2022. And then on that same page it says TikTok could, quote, attempt to influence elections in 2024. So, Director Haines, you cannot rule out that the CCP could, again, just like they did here, use TikTok as a platform to influence 2024 elections, right?
We cannot rule out that the CCP could use it, correct?
Thank you. I yield back.